Be honest, when was the last time you actually had a proper conversation with your neighbor or even visited one of your local community centers? Modern architecture is literally playing a key role in the destruction of communities. Are we becoming more disconnected now from others than ever before throughout human history? And are we heading down a dark path that's going to eventually lead us to the complete isolation and have us all locked in our houses? Or is all of this just one big conspiracy theory and we are living in fact, the best time of human history? Well, let's find out. To find this out, we need to go back and look at some of the most predominant times where communities were really flourishing. But as this is a architectural video, we'll be more focusing on the actual built environments of these communities and trying to separate that from some of the overlying societal implications of this and how the communities interacted with their surrounding architecture. However, there are some things that we simply cannot ignore or avoid, that some of these buildings may have been built by slaves or whatnot, so we'll make sure that we at least cover that when we are studying these communities. So ancient Greece leaves us with some of the most renowned architecture still to this day. The Greek state cities had a strong focus on public discourse and civic engagement. You could probably argue that generally most of the population had overall the same agreement in terms of cultural values. They had things such as the agora, which was for the free townspeople to come and congregate for either listening to their government or to gather for their military duties, but it was also actually used for a lot of buy, sell, and trading and markets. And these places were really filled with commodities, things like statues, monuments, and stowers. Stowers being like long archways where you can walk down and easily traverse the spaces and kind of really just creates that easily traversable community type of area. Now, yes, I'm completely aware that the majority of this was built by slave trade, and I'm not saying that, to revitalize communities, we need to bring back, not saying anything like that, but let's just look at the architectural elements of their design and see how architecturally this caused the communities to flourish. We'll just, minus the slaves and whatnot. So the reason their temples were built so magnificently came down to a few key points, really. So the first reason is religious significance. We can probably agree that generally all of the population lived knowing their 12 gods and having a relationship with their 12 gods. And the reason these things are built so monumentally is because they share 100% belief in their gods, and in which they are worshipping to do anything they can to show that their belief and the significance of this. You can see this directly translate into the architecture. They had a lot of ideals on perfection and harmony and how their built environment should work in almost a perfection and harmony with nature. They really idolized things from the metaphysical realm, such as things like the golden ratio and the architecture working in perfect harmony with, mathematics, proportions, and ratios. I believe a driving force behind this was something a little bit less known, but there's certain psychoactive things that they were consuming during these times. There's evidence of this. They had these drinks that contain like fungi and psychoactive ingredients. I truly believe that this is one of the factors that led them to be able to operate on this kind of different metaphysical plane when it came to designing these things. They were able to have a different understanding than we would of mathematics, proportions, and how all of things would work in perfect harmony with nature and then what they are creating. Essentially, they were more able to channel nature's original design into their ratios, proportions, and buildings. They had a lot of civic pride within their communities as well. Not only were their buildings a monument to their gods, they were also meant to be monumental to their town's power and a display of how rich and powerful they are, and they really wanted to show this off through the architecture, as well as genuinely just strongly celebrating human achievement. So let's sum up some of the key points of what made the Greek architecture flourish. We're going to say religious significance, operating in harmony with nature, civic and political pride, and celebration of human achievement. I'd say those are some of the pros that really is what made Greek architecture so profound and great. But obviously, let's look at some of the cons, which will say slavery. Not good. So we're going to move it up just a couple thousand years later to the Roman Empire, which was the 1st and 5th century BCE. You could argue that the Roman Empire had much of a very similar understanding of architecture as the Greeks did. However, they were just a bit more advanced when it came to engineering and city and urban planning. So let's narrow down the key points of what made Roman architecture great. So again, at the forefront was the worship of their religious gods. You know, they had adopted similar gods to the 12 Greek gods, and this was again one of the main driving forces behind their construction of their temples and holy places. They wanted to prove their connection to their gods and prove their divinity. So, you know, they had huge civic pride and again built monuments to testify this, you know, with lots of public bathhouses, forums, basilicas, and so on. However, there was also a huge divide between the elite and the poor. You know, the elite had hugely expensive houses with just over-the-top architecture with things like massive courtyards, mosaics, and frescoes, and yeah, probably built by slaves again. And again, just the pure celebration of human achievement was at the forefront of their architecture. Well, some things that really stood out within the Roman architecture was the introduction of complex urban planning and the design of roads, intersections, and how to get people to more easily traverse over places either by foot or by horseback. It was also easier to expand the city this way as well. And they introduced a lot of things like long-lasting, durable roads, aqueducts for water, sewage, and they incorporated a lot of communal aspects within this design. They incorporated things like amphitheaters into their local communities for entertainment aspects. So, you know, you can come and watch the gladiator fights, which is fun for the whole family, you know, as well as just many public activities being incorporated into the urban fabric. So again, let's just sum up the aspects that made the Roman architecture great. And let's look at the pros, which would be religious values, the need to display authority and attachment to the divine, celebration of achievements, communal pride, and incorporation of public amenities in the infrastructure, as well as a seamless connection between nature and the architect. I know I've read about Vitruvius, supposedly the scrolls he's written. While back then they had obviously no modern or sophisticated understanding of, you know, gravity and principles like this, but they still had a really genuine belief of nature, and you know, they thought that everything was constructed out of either water, fire, or earth and air, I think it is. And Vitruvius, you know, who designed a lot of these, had a real grounded and base understanding of how nature actually works and how to harmonize this within their architecture. And then cons, slavery again, and a huge division between the elite and the poor. Now let's jump ahead a few 10,000 years to the early Gothic period of England. You know, I truly believe this is when architecture was at its peak and flourishing the most, as this carried through a lot of the pros of those previous two societies we talked about, although it's just without the slavery, which I'd say is pretty good. But let's narrow down the reasons why this architecture was so extravagant and what made it so good. So for the third time, religion comes up at the forefront of this argument of why they were so great. You know, they simply built these buildings because they wanted to have a closer connection and a display of their dedication to their Lord. Although this was also mixed with a sense of competition between the bishops and the different churches, because they wanted to prove that, you know, we worship the Lord the most and our church is the best, as we've built it higher, we've built it greater, we've put more materials, more resources into this. And so this competition really just created more and more extravagant buildings to be created. But not only this, was also during a really prosperous economic time where there was just a huge abundance of materials, and, you know, definitely not like today when, you know, you've got timber prices going through the roof. You know, if you just want the base level timber, it's bloody expensive. They had an absolute abundance of things like concrete, masonry, stone, glass, everything. There was also the royal patronage, which essentially is just another duty of honor. And again, civic pride and community, similar to the Romans and Greeks, was just a huge and prevalent thing within these communities. They wanted to show that our town, our community is the most powerful, is the best. On the aspect of community, there was a lot of communal fellowship between everyone. Everyone was helping their neighbor. You know, if someone was running low on resources or out of food, we can assume that they could go to their neighbors and ask for help, and their neighbors would actually help them. So all of these aspects led to these communities and to the architecture to absolutely flourish, and you can just see it in the buildings. However, unlike the previous two examples, slavery was not prevalent in the construction of these designs, I mean, some people may argue that there was a form of slavery and they had, some kind of things going on with certain people, but we can pretty much well agree that the reason the buildings were constructed like this was not because of slavery. Rather, it was because of highly skilled laborers that were rewarded for their jobs. And these laborers were employed to literally, they dedicated their lives to designing and building and constructing these with absolute perfection in mind. Key takeaway point here that it is possible to build beautiful and magnificent buildings that draw in communities and help the communities and architecture to flourish, all without the obvious slave trade, and instead using highly skilled laborers and well-paid and rewarded laborers who have actually dedicated themselves to their pursuits, and their core purpose is to design these things and to create these things. If we incorporate this into the modern day and actually paid our laborers and contractors way more than they're earning now, would this actually help us improve the quality of our buildings and kind of overall improve the quality of our built environment? I actually have this belief that laborers, construction workers should be paid as much as things like, musicians or, sports, basketball players in NFL or whatever. I don't watch these kind of sports things, but I know that they're paid millions and millions, and it makes no sense that these kind of people are getting paid so much when literally the people constructing the very environments that we live in are paid hardly anything. But simply paying them more obviously will not fix these problems. These old ancient buildings, the people that constructed them, they believed that their sole life's purpose was to construct the most absolutely perfect, refined building. So simply paying laborers more probably wouldn't fix the issue. It would be a good starting point and give more of an incentive for laborers to put in more effort, because it's very easy for me to sit back and criticize lazy labor work when I'm not doing it myself. So I don't want to be the person to sit there and say that, but it is obvious that contractors and construction workers of today, at least in where I live in the modern Western world, don't really give a shit about the buildings they're making. I'm just going to be honest. I've seen some shocking labor jobs, especially here in Australia, where you have a newly built building and I can literally see this building was finished a few months ago and haven't even moved residents in yet, and there's already water leaking out of the sealant. There's sealant falling off. They've just tacked on these windows, and just there's absolutely no care, or they're showing up to site just with their nail gun, put it on, okay, whatever, just finish the job, go home, and they clearly don't care about this job. If we simply just compare those labor jobs to way back in history, you have people dedicating their lives to doing this. You can see there's just a huge disconnect between what we're constructing today and what has been constructed in the past. Now, jumping forward to today, I think the communities of today are an absolute joke. If we contrast how we interact with our communities versus how they interacted with communities way back then, it really is just not even comparable. It's a joke what our communities are today. And I'm basing my argument from living in the modern West. For those of us that do live in a first world country, it is not all bad. It is very easy to sit and complain and not be grateful for the things that we have. So let's look at some of the pros of living in the modern West of today. You could argue that it is a lot safer to live in these countries. Yes, it is starting to get worse in certain places of the world, but literally compare your lifestyle to someone in a third world country and how they are living. It's a big argument for people to sit there and say, oh, the West is falling, you got to go to places outside of the West because the government's controlling us so much, we have no freedom in the West anymore. Our cities are designed where we have easy access to things like amenities and healthcare. I mean, I have a lot of strong beliefs on the actual healthcare system, and the way that it's run is not right, and modern day healthcare focuses on the treatment of symptoms rather than the core problems itself, which that's a whole nother topic and not exactly architectural, so we'll leave that out for now. But we could argue that at least for emergency situations, you can get to doctors and hospitals more easily, similar to schools and food places and restaurants. If you want to go to school, it is relatively easy to just walk to a school. That is a pro of the modern communities of today. Cars themselves are a huge argument whether these make it better or worse for communities. I know people were saying that cars have destroyed, the way we traverse everything, because, you get in your car and you're stuck on the road, there's traffic, but it also gives you a sense of freedom. I think this is a huge topic that I will probably cover in a different video, but we'll say cars are overall, it could be good or bad, but they help you to traverse at least. Similar to historic times, you could argue that the community events still exist where citizens come together for things like concerts, festivals, markets. Although this is extremely subjective whether it's actually beneficial or not, because I personally believe that these modern day activities of communal events are not beneficial to society. You know, say back in the Greek times or any of these times that I've listed, communities would gather for things like public discourse, buy, sell, and trading, and for them to all worship their Lord together. Whereas now, these kind of concerts, festivals, community events are all about coming just to worship some singer or artist or DJ. And, you know, I'm gonna get a lot of people saying, oh, but it's fun, it's a good time, you know, we all connect to each other. Yeah, I get that. But is the sole act of going and worshiping some DJ or some artist, is that actually benefiting the whole society and public benefit as a whole, or is it simply just a mindless activity that you think it's connecting people? But again, that's a completely subjective argument. I'll just leave it at that. But you can still argue that yes, community events do happen. You also have things like markets, you know, buy, sell, and trade, all that kind of thing. But I'd still argue that it is kind of getting washed out and is nowhere near as communal as it used to be. So let's look at some of the cons of our communities today in terms of the built environment. The main reason our built environment, I believe, is deteriorating so much today and becoming so soulless and more boring is simply because of cost. That all of these buildings are built with cost in mind and to be the most cost efficient buildings. You know, back then when they were building the cathedrals, I'm sure they weren't sitting there thinking, oh, you know, we want to put this buttress on, but it's going to be too expensive. I'm sure God won't mind. You know, we'll just build it smaller, you know, get the cheaper materials. I'm sure they were not saying things like this. Whereas now, you know, you want to build a little bit higher and you go, no, well, we have to take the 4 floors off because that's too expensive for us. So cost plays a huge factor in why buildings look the way they do today. Not only that, but you know, at the forefront of all these buildings throughout history was religious values, and now that is completely gone from all the buildings today. You know, it's kind of separated from the built environment. No longer are these things actually part of the built environment. They're kind of just it's kind of been lowered down in society. It's like, oh, if you're religious, that's cool, but this is just a building. You know, we're not focusing on that. This is just a building. You know, you can make that argument. That can go a lot deeper. I may actually make a sole video going deeper into this specific topic because I don't want this whole video to be just about the loss of religion in society today. That's a whole nother video. Another main reason is apartments now are maximized for GFA efficiency. GFA meaning gross floor area. You know, when architects receive a job from their client, you get the site boundaries and you sit there and go, you know, the developer wants you to go, how can we fit as much floor space into this square meter area as possible? With things like livability, communal aspects, how will these people interact with each other, all those kind of things are just at the back of their minds. They want simply, how can we cram as much GFA into these as possible? Understandably, this is not a conscious decision or like a deeper conspiracy, like, oh yeah, all the developers are trying to break away, you know, they don't care about how people live, they just want. But it is pretty obvious that the driving force behind buildings now at the forefront is just GFA optimization. You know, being in the architecture industry is that they're actually doing away with a lot of ornamental design or like nice looking new buildings, monumental kind of buildings. They just are doing away with a lot of those, and a real big trend right now, at least in Australia, is just simply GFA optimized apartments and affordable housing to kind of their attempt to resolve the housing crisis, to build as many apartments as you can in the most short amount of time and for the cheapest possible materials and resources. And with all of this, the genuine interest or genuine thought of how people live in these environments are just kind of being lost because they're just no longer at the forefront of thought. You know, and also in today, not as many people own anything or own property. Most people are now living in these apartments where they've been crammed in. Unless you're either really lucky or wealthy, you own a house and you have a little bit of land and property within that to do what you want. Although even on your own property, you're now restricted by money, resources, and especially council restrictions on what you can and can't do to your property. Like, in some places you can't even grow food on your own property. You can't have, you know, your own animals, or you want to, you know, build an extension to your house. You have to go through council, get all of these contractors, resources, all of this. You could argue these are for a good reason, but again, these are just more limitations put onto us. So do you think there are things from the old societies that we can bring back and incorporate into our modern built environment to help the architecture re-flourish again? So the forefront thing I'm going to say is religion. And I'm going to talk about specifically the modern day churches or modern day religious design is an absolute joke compared to what it used to be. I've seen so many of these projects where they employ some prestigious architecture firm to design a church, and then you look at the end result, and honestly, if you compare that to what they were building, back then, it is an absolute just joke of a building. Because you have the architects, the consultants, and the contractors. All of these people are not even religious. To them, it's simply just another job, and the architects thinking like, oh, how can we make this and this? I truly believe that religious buildings should be built solely by people that are dedicated to that religion in themselves. I know that's going to be extremely controversial thought. If you want to get down to the sole reason why these new buildings are not as magnificent as they were back in the past is because at least these religious buildings are just being built by Joe's contractor, some random architecture firm where maybe one person kind of believes in God and they're like, oh yeah, we'll try and let's just look at some studies and we'll draw up, get the cheapest contractor for the plasterboard on the roof. For the tiles, we'll just use some random material. I truly believe, if we bring back people that are actually dedicated to that God, you say, if it's like a church, a cathedral, a mosque, a synagogue, all these kind of buildings. If you had a whole board of people that are actually part of a church or part of something, and they all have the same beliefs and value, from the developer to the architect to the consultants to the contractors to the laborers, all shared that same value, I guarantee that building, even in trying economic times, that building would be far more significant than how they are being built today. Now, my second point is contractors not having any incentive to build structures that are beautiful or refined or will stand the test of time anymore. It just simply comes down to the reason that contractors simply have no incentive. Their pay is like average, or I know in Australia their pay is like okay if you're a laborer or a contractor, but if we want to see, it's simple logic. If you want to see better buildings and a more cared for, a more meticulously designed, a more articulated built environment, it comes down to the very sole fact of paying the contractors more, and that the contractors and the builders have more incentive to do their job right and to take more care. I can even separate this from the religious argument. We'll leave that out and just say simply just paying the contractors more would result in better buildings. Simple as that. But again, that's going to tie into more deeper societal impacts, and obviously there are reasons why we can't do this, so I'm going to just leave it at that. Now, going back to the Greek and the Roman societies where they were just more communal and more interconnected with each other. This leads into a lot of deeper societal issues that starts going out of architecture, because that's what it really comes down to. A lot of these problems in the world are not simply because, architecture is not as good. It comes down to a lot of core fundamental societal problems, and really is an issue with the individual opposed to the built environment. The real reason that communities are being lost today is not solely because of architecture. It goes way beyond architecture, and it comes down to the bottom line is there is no idealistic answer for this. I can't simply sit here and say, building beautiful buildings will completely solve all society's issues and everything will be solved. That's not what I'm saying, but we just have to agree that we have to leave it at that for now. And that will lead into my next problem, which I think this actually kind of gives us a little bit of a glimpse into an actual solution through the built environment. So let's go and look at someone who's actually attempted change. So it's obvious that from making any real pivotal change, a lot of economic aspects are hindering this, as well as so we no longer have an abundance of materials and resources, unlike back in the Gothic ages where they had an abundance of materials, where materials were cheap and easy to resource. So now part 4 of this video, we're going to look at someone who actually dared to step out and attempt to change at least something. It's obvious that if we want to change this in the modern day, we have so many limiting aspects such as economic restrictions. We no longer have an abundance of materials, unlike they did back in the Gothic Anglican times. And just the overall economy is pretty screwed at the moment in terms of actually daring to step out of these norms that we have within our built environment. So how would we even solve this huge issue of the deterioration of the modern day communities? My answer is you'd need to completely redefine what communities, cities, and dwellings even are. But this is a huge thing to tackle simply on your own. Although, we're gonna look at someone, a case study, of somebody that dared to actually try to redefine this and actually got pretty far. So somebody took this on alone and they tried to redefine what community meant. And this was called Habitat 67. Now, I do have a lot of criticism about this project. I don't necessarily think that, yes, this is the solution and this solves all of our problem, but we're gonna more look at it from the aspect is that it's rather just an example of somebody that just tried to redefine something and got backing and got support from their government and was actually able to construct what they had designed. I believe this was a architecture's thesis project. This specific project itself doesn't actually necessarily take on the issues we've been discussing in this video, but the point is, his name is Moshe, I don't know how to pronounce it, Moshe Safdie. He dared to take on the everyday norms and conventions and to completely just twist it and redefine it. And I strongly believe we simply need more people like that, and for people like that to be more funded and have more backing from their local governments, from their local communities, people that are willing to just step out of the norms and say, no, this is not how I believe things should be done. Instead, why don't we try it like this? Why don't we just build it and see how this goes, and at least dare to step out of the norms and constrictions that we all have to really, redefine current trends. We need more people like that in power to just be able to step out of these constrictions and the norms that we have to even just, obviously, even if it's not right, even if it ends up failing, just to simply step out of these norms and to at least just try something, Again, there is no real answer or simple idealistic solution to what we've been discussing in this video, but I truly believe you just need a project that simply steps out of current trends and to just attempt to redefine what we know as communities today.